The bar on Fifth Avenue was the kind of place where the city's elite went to be seen, a dimly lit sanctuary of polished mahogany and low conversation. Crystal decanters caught the soft light, and the air smelled of expensive cologne and aged whiskey. For the 6 men who had just pushed 2 tables together near the back, the world was exactly as it should be. They were young, fit, and loud, their laughter a little too boisterous for the refined atmosphere. They had the look of men who had just conquered something, or were about to. Sarah Jenkins sat alone at the bar, a half-empty glass of red wine in front of her. She was nursing it slowly, her eyes occasionally drifting to the notes spread out on the counter. To anyone watching, she looked like any other professional woman unwinding after a long day at the office. But her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a conservative gray blazer. She was unremarkable in this crowd of designer labels and flashy jewelry, and that was exactly how she preferred it. She was also a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy, and the classified documents in her leather satchel contained the final operational plans for the most sensitive SEAL mission of the year. The men at the back table grew louder as the drinks flowed. They were bragging, their voices carrying across the room. Sarah caught snippets of their conversation, inside jokes about the teams, veiled references to the sandbox, and a general air of invincibility that only young warriors still waiting to see real combat could possess. She didn't need to see the faded tattoos peeking out from under their rolled-up sleeves to know they were Navy. She could smell it on them. She turned back to her wine, hoping to finish it in peace. The mission she was overseeing was weighing heavily on her mind. It was a high-risk, high-reward target deep in hostile territory. The intelligence was solid, but the variables were a nightmare. If anything went wrong, if the insertion was compromised, if the intel was 48 hours old, if the wind shifted 2 knots, men would die. Good men. Men just like the loud ones at the back table. She was mentally running through the extraction protocols for the 3rd time that evening when she felt a presence beside her. One of the young men, the loudest of the group, had ambled up to the bar to order another round. He was tall, with a lantern jaw and the cocky swagger of someone who had recently graduated at the top of his class at BUD/S. He was also very, very drunk. "Hey, excuse me," he slurred, leaning into her space to wave at the bartender. His elbow knocked against hers. Hard. Sarah's wine glass tipped. The deep red liquid cascaded over the rim, splashing across her blazer, soaking into the sleeve of her white blouse, and spreading like a bloodstain across the scattered papers on the bar. "Whoa, my bad," the man said, but there was no apology in his tone. He looked at the spreading stain on her jacket, then at her face, and then, inexplicably, he laughed. He actually laughed. "Guess you shouldn't sit so close to the action, huh?" At the back table, his buddies howled with laughter. One of them cupped his hands around his mouth and yelled, "Splash! Why one down, Jenkins?" The name hit Sarah like a slap. Jenkins. They were hooting and hollering, using her name as a joke, completely oblivious to who they were mocking. The bartender rushed over with a towel, apologizing profusely. The drunk SEAL slapped a $50 bill on the bar. "That cover it?" he asked, not waiting for an answer before swaggering back to his table, high-fiving his friends as he went. Sarah sat perfectly still. The wine was cold and sticky against her skin. Her documents, the operational plans she had spent weeks perfecting, were soaked. She carefully gathered them, dabbing them with a napkin, her expression utterly blank. Inside, a cold fury was building, a quiet, controlled rage that would have made any of her subordinates in the Fleet Anti-Terrorism Security Team very, very nervous. Yeah, she didn't look at the table of laughing men. She didn't say a word. She simply signaled the bartender for her check, gathered her ruined papers, and walked out into the cool night air, leaving the laughter behind her. She didn't go home. She went straight to the office, changed into a spare uniform she kept in her locker, and spent the next 3 hours carefully drying and reconstructing her notes. By 3 a.m., she had a clean copy and a very clear memory of the name his friends had called him. Jenkins. Petty Officer Jenkins. The next morning, Sarah stood at the front of a secure briefing room in the basement of a building that didn't officially exist on any map. The air was cool and recycled, smelling of coffee and floor polish. On the wall behind her, a high-resolution satellite image of a compound in eastern Afghanistan was projected. Red circles marked entry points, enemy positions, and the primary target. Seated before her in 3 neat rows were the 14 men who would be inserting into that compound in 72 hours. They were dressed in cargo pants and t-shirts, their faces clean-shaven but etched with the fatigue of pre-mission workups. They were the best of the best, the sharp end of the spear, and sitting in the second row, looking slightly hungover and distinctly uncomfortable, was Petty Officer Jenkins. He was staring at the floor, his jaw tight. He hadn't looked up once since she walked in. His buddies from the bar were scattered throughout the room, and as Sarah had taken her place at the podium, she had watched the color drain from their faces one by one as recognition dawned. The quiet woman at the bar, the spilled wine, the laughter. It was all coming back to them in a horrible, gut-churning wave. Sarah pulled up the first slide. It was a 3-dimensional terrain map of the target area. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm, professional, and utterly devoid of emotion. "Good morning. I'm Lieutenant Commander Sarah Jenkins. I'm the Mission Operations Officer. For the next 6 hours, I will be walking you through every phase of this operation. By the time we are done, you will know this compound better than the back of your hands. You will know where every guard stands, when he takes a piss, and which direction the wind will be blowing when you hit the ground." She clicked to the next slide. It was a detailed schematic of the compound's interior. She still hadn't looked directly at Jenkins, who was now sitting ramrod straight, a fine sheen of sweat on his forehead. The primary objective is the high-value target in this room here," she said, pointing with a laser pointer. "The secondary objective is intelligence collection. You will be on the ground for no more than 30 minutes. Any deviation from the timeline and the QRF will be scrambled, but they are 20 minutes out. That is a long time." She paused, letting that sink in. She finally let her gaze drift across the room, passing over each man. When her eyes met Jenkins's, she held them there for just a fraction of a second longer than necessary. It was enough. The man flinched as if he'd been struck. "I need you to understand the stakes," she continued, her voice hardening slightly. "The intelligence we have is solid, but it's time-sensitive. If we are compromised, if you make a sound, if you deviate from the plan, this mission fails. And failure is not an option. Not for me and not for you." She launched into the details, the insertion point, the communication blackout protocols, the code words, the emergency rally points. She was meticulous, precise, and demanding. She asked questions randomly, forcing them to stay sharp. When one of Jenkins's buddies from the bar stumbled over an answer about the primary exfiltration route, she didn't humiliate him. She simply repeated the information calmly and moved on. That was worse. It would have been easier if she had yelled. Hours later, when the briefing was finally over, the men filed out in silence. Sarah stayed at the podium, organizing her notes. She heard the shuffle of feet and looked up. Jenkins was standing there, alone. His face was pale. He looked like a man waiting to be executed. "Ma'am," he started, his voice cracking. "About last night, I didn't know. I'm so sorry. It was disrespectful and I—" Sarah held up a hand, cutting him off. She studied him for a long moment. He was young, arrogant, talented, and right now he was terrified, not of the mission, but of her. "Forget the wine, petty officer," she said quietly. "I have." Relief flickered in his eyes. "I have already forgotten the wine," she repeated, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "But I have not forgotten the laughter. I have not forgotten the disrespect. and I have not forgotten that you and your friends acted like children in a place where adults were working." Jenkins swallowed hard. "Ma'am, You are about to go into a dark room full of men who want to kill you," she interrupted. "I am the one who planned how you get in, how you accomplish your mission, and how you get out alive. Your life, and the lives of your teammates, depend on my work. So my question to you, petty officer, is this: do you trust me?" The question hung in the air between them. It was the only question that mattered. Jenkins looked at her. The woman from the bar was gone. In her place stood an officer who held his fate in her hands. He thought about the compound, the guards, the long minutes waiting for the QRF. He thought about going into that dark room, and he realized that the only person in the world who could guarantee he came back was standing right in front of him. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice firm. "I trust you." Sarah nodded once. "Good. Then go get some sleep. You're going to need it." He turned to leave, but stopped at the door. "Ma'am, for what it's worth, and I really am sorry." She didn't look up from her notes. "I know. Now close the door on your way out." When the door clicked shut, Sarah finally allowed herself a small, tight smile. He was a good kid, arrogant, but good. He would learn. They all did. And in 2 days, when they were on the ground, she would be in the operations center, watching every heartbeat, making sure they all came home. That was her job, and she was very, very good at it. 2 days later, Sarah was in the heart of the operations center. It was a cavernous, windowless room dominated by a wall of screens displaying live satellite feeds, drone footage, and digital maps. The air hummed with the low thrum of servers and the quiet murmur of intelligence analysts. It was 2 a.m. local time in Afghanistan, half a world away, and the sun was just beginning to cast long shadows over the target compound. Sarah stood behind the central console, a headset curled around her ear. She was sipping cold coffee from a chipped mug, her eyes fixed on the main screen. 4 tiny blips, representing the 2 MH-60 Black Hawk helicopters, were crossing the border on the map. They were 30 minutes out. "Eagle Claw, this is Watchtower. Comms check, over." Her voice was calm, steady. "Watchtower, Eagle Claw. Loud and clear." It was the mission commander's voice crackling through the speaker. Jenkins's team leader. Sarah acknowledged and fell silent. There was nothing to do now but watch and wait. The room was tense, focused. This was the quiet before the storm. The drone footage switched to infrared. The helicopters were dark shapes against the cooler ground, flying low and fast, hugging the terrain to avoid radar. Sarah watched them navigate the mountain passes she had spent weeks analyzing. Every wadi, every ridgeline, every potential landing zone, she had mapped it all. The pilots were following her route to the meter. 10 minutes out, the drone operator announced. Sarah's heart rate didn't change. She had done this before. The fear was always there, a cold knot in her stomach, but she had learned to use it. It sharpened her focus. She zoomed in on the compound. There were the guards, just as the intelligence had predicted. 1 at the gate, 2 patrolling the perimeter, 1 on the roof. She counted them. 4. It matched. "Watchtower, Eagle Claw. We have the objective in sight. Going silent." The mission commander's voice was a whisper now. The room held its breath. On the screen, the helicopters flared and descended, kicking up clouds of dust. The SEALs fast roped down, 30 feet to the ground, and melted into the shadows. Sarah watched the blips representing the assaulters spread out, moving with precision. They flowed around the compound like water, converging on the main building. Then the feed from the team's helmet cams came online. Sarah was suddenly looking through the eyes of the point man. She saw the compound wall, the door, the muffled crump of a breaching charge. She was inside. The world dissolved into a chaotic montage of green-tinted night vision. Dark rooms, shouted commands in Pashto, the sharp, deafening crack of gunfire. Sarah's eyes darted across the screens, tracking every team member's position, every heat signature. She was aware of the drone operator calling out enemy movements, of the intelligence officers feeding her real-time updates. "Contact! Room 220!" a voice screamed in her ear. It was Jenkins's team, the primary target room. Sarah pulled up Jenkins's bio feed. His heart rate was spiking, but his position was steady. He was moving correctly, covering his sector. On the helmet cam, she saw a door explode inward. She saw the flash of a muzzle. She saw a man, the high-value target, reaching for a weapon, and she saw Jenkins react. He moved like he had been born to it. 2 shots, controlled, precise. The target went down. "Target down! Target down! Securing the room!" The operations center erupted in a muted chorus of relieved breaths and quiet affirmations. Sarah didn't cheer. She didn't even smile. She was already on to the next phase. "Eagle Claw Watchtower. An extraction window opens in 15. I need a sit rep on the secondary objective. Over." The next 15 minutes were an exercise in controlled chaos. The team swept the compound, gathering intelligence, clearing rooms. There were more firefights, more tense moments. Sarah guided them, rerouting teams to reinforce weak points, calling in the drone to track fleeing insurgents. She was the calm eye in the center of the storm, processing information from a dozen sources and feeding it back to the men on the ground in a clear, concise stream. Finally, the words everyone wanted to hear. "Watchtower Eagle Claw, package secure. All friendlies are up, requesting extraction." Sarah allowed herself one deep breath. "Copy, Eagle Claw. Extraction is clear. Birds are inbound. Good work." She leaned back in her chair, on her neck and shoulders aching with tension she hadn't realized she was holding. On the screen, she watched the SEALs pile back into the helicopters, the rotors already spinning. As the Blackhawks lifted off, kicking up more dust, she felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. The mission was a success, the target was dead, the intelligence was captured, and every single one of her men was coming home. 24 hours later, the team was back at the staging base. Sarah had flown in on a support plane to conduct the initial debriefing. She stood in a makeshift briefing room, a small, hot tent in the middle of the desert. The men filed in, still carrying their gear, their faces haggard but triumphant. They smelled of sweat, cordite, and jet fuel. When they saw her, a ripple went through the group. And it wasn't the awkwardness of the bar incident anymore. It was something else. Respect. The mission commander, a grizzled senior chief with eyes that had seen too much, walked up to her and extended his hand. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough, "that was the cleanest insertion we've ever had. You put us right on the money." Sarah shook his hand. "You did the hard part, Senior Chief." He shook his head. "The hard part is getting there and back. You got us there. You got us back." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Thank you." One by one, the other men filed past her. Some just nodded. Others murmured a quiet, "Good job, ma'am." They were the simple courtesies of professionals acknowledging another professional. Then Jenkins was standing in front of her. He looked different. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by the quiet confidence of a man who had just looked death in the face and blinked second. His uniform was rumpled, his face smudged with dirt, but his eyes were clear. He stopped and stood at attention. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "Ma'am," he said finally. His voice was steady. "I just wanted to say, I get it now. I get what you do. I get who you are." He hesitated, searching for the right words. "Back at the bar, I saw a woman with a glass of wine. I was an idiot. I'm sorry for that. But now I see the officer who brought us home." Sarah studied him. This was the moment. She could have made him squirm. She could have reminded him of the spilled drink, the laughter, the disrespect. She could have used her power to humble him further. Instead, she simply nodded. "Welcome home, petty officer." He blinked, surprised by the lack of reproach. "Thank you, ma'am." "You did good in there," she added, her voice quiet. "I was watching. The shot on the primary target, textbook." A flicker of pride crossed his face, quickly suppressed. "Thank you, ma'am." "Now go get some chow and some sleep. The debriefing is in 4 hours. Don't be late." He almost smiled. "I won't be, ma'am. I promise." He turned and walked away, joining his teammates. Sarah watched him go. She saw one of his friends clap him on the shoulder, and she heard the low murmur of their voices. They were talking about her. She could feel it. But the tone was different now. She walked out of the tent and into the blazing sun. The desert stretched out before her, vast and indifferent. Behind her, she could hear the sound of the men laughing, the tension finally breaking. And it was a good sound. It was the sound of the living. 6 months later, Sarah was back in Virginia, sitting in the same bar on Fifth Avenue. It was a quiet Tuesday night. She was in civilian clothes, a glass of red wine in front of her, a book in her hand. She came here sometimes to think, to decompress. The irony of the location wasn't lost on her. The door opened, and a group of young men walked in. They were loud, fresh-faced, and full of swagger, new guys. She could spot them a mile away. They took a table near the back and started ordering drinks, their laughter filling the room. She smiled to herself and returned to her book. A few minutes later, she felt a presence beside her. She looked up. It was Jenkins. He was in his dress uniform, looking sharp and professional. He was alone. "Ma'am," he said, a little nervously, "but I saw you sitting here. I hope I'm not interrupting." "Petty Officer Jenkins," she said, closing her book. "You're not interrupting. Sit down." He slid onto the stool next to her. He looked at the table of loud young men in the back, and a knowing smile crossed his face. "New guys," he said. "They do seem a bit enthusiastic," Sarah agreed. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Jenkins signaled the bartender. "I'll have a glass of the house red," he said. Then he looked at Sarah. "And I'll get her another one, too." The bartender brought the drinks. Jenkins picked up his glass and turned to face her. His expression was serious now, all traces of the nervous young man gone. "I never properly thanked you," he said, "for that night. Not for the wine, but for not letting what I did affect the mission. For being professional when I wasn't. And for bringing us home." Sarah looked at him. She saw a good officer. A good man. One who had learned a valuable lesson about respect, not just for rank, but for the unseen work that made their world possible. "You don't need to thank me, petty officer," she said. "I was just doing my job." He shook his head. "No, ma'am. You were doing a lot more than that, and I know that now." He raised his glass. "To the mission," he said. Sarah raised hers. "To the mission." They clinked glasses and drank. Across the room, the new guys erupted in laughter over some inside joke. Jenkins glanced at them, then back at Sarah. "You know," he said, a glint in his eye, "if one of those knuckleheads spills a drink on you, I'd be happy to have a word with them, set them straight." Sarah laughed. It was a real laugh, warm and genuine. "That's very kind of you, petty officer, but I think I can handle it." "I don't doubt it for a second, ma'am," he said, smiling. They sat there for another hour, talking about nothing in particular, the books they were reading, the places they'd been, the things they'd seen. Two professionals, bound by a shared experience, sharing a quiet moment in a city that never slept. And when Sarah finally walked out into the night, she knew that somewhere out there, a group of young SEALs was preparing for their next mission. And if they were smart, they would remember that respect wasn't about rank or bravado. It was about the quiet competence of the people who had your back, whether they were in the field with you or sitting alone at a bar. nursing a glass of wine.